The winter wind did not knock. It broke doors, crushed roofs, and erased the names of homes from the land. In Cheyenne Basin, Wyoming, people believed they were prepared, until the night the cold walked in and decided who would stay and who would disappear. One house stood where others fell, not made of strength, not made of pride, but made of understanding. A quiet cowboy, a dog no one wanted, children with nowhere left to go. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Cheyenne Basin, Wyoming, looked peaceful, only to someone who had never tried to outlast it. The town sat in a shallow bowl of prairie and low ridges where the wind could gather speed like a grudging animal, circle once, and then come at you from the side with teeth. In late October of 1907, the daylight arrived thin and hurried, as if even the sun didn't want to linger. The mornings carried a brittle chill that made water buckets glaze at the rim, and by afternoon, the air could still warm just enough to trick a man into leaving his coat unbuttoned, until dusk rolled in and the temperature fell again, hard and sudden, like a door slammed shut. The sky had that western clarity that promised honesty and delivered danger. You could see the weather coming for miles, and it could still reach you before you were ready. Main Street was a short spine of wood-fronted buildings, general store, livery, post office, a small saloon with windows that never looked quite clean. Beyond that, homesteads spread out like scattered dice, cabins of freshly cut timber, a few half-dug shelters banked with sod, and frames of houses waiting for walls before the first serious snow. Folks worked fast because Wyoming winter didn't believe in mercy. It believed in lessons. On the north edge of town, where grass gave way to pale dirt and the land rose toward the wind, Elias Crowder had staked his claim. Elias was 33, with the kind of build that came from long days in the saddle and longer days on foot. He wasn't especially tall, maybe 5'10", but he carried himself as if he'd learned early that height didn't decide anything out here. His shoulders were broad, his hands large and weather-scored, knuckles thickened from rope and rail and cold. His hair was dark brown, cut short because the wind liked to grab loose things, and his beard came in fast if he let it, more shadow than flourish, like he couldn't be bothered to decorate his face. His jaw had sharp angles that made him look severe at a glance, but the severity eased when he spoke, because Elias spoke like a man measuring his words for weight, not for show. His eyes were the color of creek water under stone, gray-blue, steady, and always watching. People said he stared too long at ordinary things, a hinge, a crack in a board, a cloud line. Elias would have called it paying attention. There had been a winter before this one, years earlier, that had bent him into the man he was. Folks didn't know every detail, but they knew enough. A cattle drive gone wrong in a whiteout, a partner lost somewhere between fence posts that couldn't be seen, and Elias spending a night alone with the wind trying to bury him. He'd come back with frost-scarred fingertips and a quietness that wasn't shyness. It was the silence of someone who had listened to a storm up close and believed what it said. After that, Elias treated winter like an opponent you respected, never feared, never mocked, never ignored. He lived with a horse named Morrow, a rangy bay gelding with a graying muzzle that made him look older than his years. Morrow was 12, sturdy in the chest but a little stiff in the hindquarters when the mornings ran cold. His left ear had a small notch, as if someone long ago had tried to mark him and done it clumsily. The horse had patient eyes and a way of breathing that sounded like a sigh when you tightened the cinch, as though he'd seen enough human plans to know most of them didn't survive contact with weather. Elias treated him less like equipment and more like an old soldier, brushed him slow, checked his hooves twice, and spoke to him in a low voice as if the horse could understand the difference between a complaint and a warning. Elias's plan for a house didn't look like anyone else's plan. While other men hauled logs and argued over roofing pitch, Elias collected stone, dark, dense rock from a low outcrop west of town. He loaded it into a wagon until the springs groaned, then brought it home and stacked it in neat piles like he was building a wall for a fort. He also gathered clay from a cut bank along a sluggish creek, the kind of clay that stained your palms red-brown and held together when you squeezed it. And he cut prairie grass where it grew tall and tough, bundled it, and hauled it in. Some of the grass he left loose to dry, some he packed into tight, heavy bundles he tied with twine until they felt like they had weight and purpose. From a distance, the start of his building project looked like a man preparing to feed 100 horses through winter. Up close, it was stranger. Piles of stone, heaps of dried grass, and buckets of clay, like the ingredients of a recipe nobody had written down. The first person to speak up about it, loudly anyway, was Hank Pruitt. Hank was a sawmill man who'd followed timber jobs until he found Cheyenne Basin, and he walked like his hips didn't believe in sitting still. He was in his early 40s, tall and raw-boned, with a narrow face and a mustache that curled at the ends, as if he styled it out of sheer stubbornness. His hands were always stained with pitch. Hank liked to laugh first and think later, which was exactly the sort of personality the frontier produced in bulk. When Hank saw Elias stacking stone and grass, he leaned on the rail fence and called out, "Crowder, you building a house or a haystack you plan to marry?" Elias didn't stop what he was doing. He set another stone down with care, then wiped his hands on his pants. "Neither," he said. "I'm building something that stays warm." Hank snorted. "Warm's what a stove's for." Elias glanced toward the horizon where the light was already thinning. A stove is what you feed when everything else fails. That answer didn't satisfy Hank, which was half the point. Hank left shaking his head, the kind of shake that meant he'd be telling the story in the saloon by nightfall, making it bigger, funnier, and, if the audience liked it, meaner. By evening, the story had spread. At the general store, the clerk, a slender young woman named Clara Baines, watched Elias come in for nails and lamp oil and raised an eyebrow. Clara was 27, with auburn hair pinned up in a tidy coil that always threatened to loosen when she got busy. Her skin was pale and freckled from working near windows all day, and she had quick eyes that noticed what people bought and what they didn't. Clara had come west to care for an ailing aunt and stayed after the aunt passed because she discovered she liked the hard honesty of Wyoming more than the soft lies of the place she'd left. She wasn't unkind, but she didn't waste sympathy on foolishness. "So," she said, sliding the lamp oil across the counter, "they say you're building a house out of pasture." Elias set his coins down one by one. "They say a lot." Clara gave him a look that was half amusement, half curiosity. "Are they wrong?" Elias didn't smile, but something in his eyes warmed. Grass holds air, air holds heat. If you keep the wind out, you keep the warmth in. That's not magic, it's just how the world works. Clara leaned forward slightly, like she was listening for something deeper. "And the stone?" "Stone remembers the sun," Elias said, "even when the sun is stingy." Clara nodded once, slow. She wasn't convinced exactly, but she wasn't laughing either. "Well," she said, "if your pasture house falls over, I'll sell you the nails to rebuild. If it doesn't, I'll have to admit you're the first man I've met who can argue with winter." Outside the store, the wind slapped the sign and made it creak like a warning. Elias took his purchases and headed back toward his land, coat collar turned up, boots crunching in the first brittle frost that had formed along the street's edge. On his way out of town, he passed the boarding house where Sarah Larkin stood on the porch steps shaking out a rug. Sarah was 31, built sturdy through the shoulders and hips like a woman used to lifting water pails and carrying troubles without asking permission. Her hair was the color of wheat toasted too long, dark blonde with sun-bleached ends, and she wore it in a loose braid that brushed her back. Wind had put a permanent rosy bite in her cheeks, and her skin had that tanned, weathered look that came from years outdoors, not from leisure. Sarah's eyes were hazel, sharp, and attentive, and she had a habit of narrowing them when she listened, like she didn't trust words until they proved themselves. She'd lost her husband 2 winters ago to pneumonia that turned fast and brutal, and the loss had made her both softer and harder, softer with children and strays, harder with men who bragged. She watched Elias pass with his bundles. "Elias Crowder," she called, not unkindly. "You really building with grass and rock?" Elias paused. "Grass, rock, and patience?" Sarah's mouth twitched as if she wanted to smile but didn't want to encourage foolishness. "Patience is fine. Winter isn't." "That's why I'm not rushing," Elias said. Rushing builds drafts. Sarah snorted once, a sound that carried a hint of laughter. Only you would say something like that. He tipped his hat, a small gesture, respectful. Only me, he agreed, and kept walking. That night, the sky went clear as glass. Stars sharpened into pinpoints, and the cold settled into the low places like water seeking a basin. Elias fed Morrow extra grain and checked the horse's blanket, then went back to his work by lantern light, setting stones into a low foundation he dug down past the soft topsoil. He wanted the base solid, away from moisture, away from rot, away from the kind of slow ruin you didn't notice until it was too late. The prairie grass bundles, dense, tied hard, waited in a stack nearby. He ran his hand along one, feeling the tightness, the way the stems pressed together and resisted. It didn't feel like feed anymore. It felt like a building block. A coyote yipped somewhere far off, and another answered. The sound carried over the open land like a joke told in the dark. Elias glanced toward the horizon and listened. He didn't mind coyotes. They were honest. They took what they needed and moved on. Men sometimes did the same thing and then told stories about it. He thought about the town's laughter, Hank's sneer, the way people clung to what they knew because what they knew had gotten them this far. He couldn't blame them. Tradition was a kind of blanket. It was just that some blankets were too thin. Behind him, Morrow shifted and exhaled, and Elias heard it as a reminder. Not everything that mattered spoke in words. He turned back to his foundation, laid another stone, and tamped it into place. The work was slow, methodical, almost prayerful in its repetition. There was humor in it too, if you looked the right way. A man in a wide land-stacking rock like he planned to out-stubborn the sky, but Elias wasn't trying to win, he was trying to endure. That was different. By the time the lantern sputtered low, the outline of his plan had begun to take shape, a rectangle of stone that promised walls, shelter, and a future that didn't depend on luck. He stood inside it for a moment, imagining warmth held steady, imagining the wind outside unable to find purchase. He imagined children, maybe his someday, maybe someone else's, laughing without chattering teeth. He imagined a winter that came roaring like a god and found, for once, a door that wouldn't open. Elias stepped out, pulled his coat tighter, and headed toward the small tent he still slept in until the house rose enough to claim him. The air tasted like iron. Somewhere in the dark, the prairie waited, and beyond it winter waited too, patient, relentless, certain. Elias Crowder with his stone. Piles and grass bundles waited back, and in that waiting, the first chapter of the town's lesson had already begun. By early November, Cheyenne Basin no longer pretended to be undecided about winter. The mornings arrived wrapped in frost, the kind that stiffened leather and made breath hang in the air like pale smoke. Wind combed the prairie grass flat, pressing it down until the land looked shorn and humbled. The sky remained clear, brutally honest, offering no shelter in its vastness. It was the season when men either finished their work or learned to regret the things they had left undone. Elias Crowder worked as if time itself were a material to be shaped, not a threat to be outrun. Where others hammered and sawed with frantic energy, Elias moved slowly, deliberately. Each morning he inspected the stone foundation he had laid, running his fingers along the joints, feeling for gaps, for places where cold might one day sneak in unnoticed. He believed flaws were not born loud, they whispered first. He widened the trench on the windward side, banking it carefully so meltwater would drain away instead of pooling. The prairie rewarded such caution. The soil here remembered moisture the way grudges were remembered, quietly, until it decided to act. The grass bundles came next. Elias lifted each one as if weighing its intentions. They were heavy now, tightly bound, stiff with dryness, smelling faintly of summer even as winter pressed closer. He stacked them between the stone courses, compressing them further, tamping them down until they resisted his weight. He did not build upward too fast. Height invited mistakes, density invited survival. From the road, the structure looked squat and unfinished, more mound than house. Children on their way back from errands slowed to stare. A few laughed, a few didn't. One of those who didn't was Matthew Ives. Matthew was new to Cheyenne Basin, a man in his late 20s with a narrow frame and an earnest face that hadn't yet learned how to hide disappointment. His hair was light brown, perpetually falling into his eyes, and his beard grew in patchy, as if unsure it belonged. He wore clothes that still carried the creases of store shelves rather than the wear of long use. Matthew had come west from Illinois after a failed venture in farm machinery, a failure that had cost him more pride than money. Since arriving, he had taken work wherever he could find it, mucking stalls, splitting wood, mending fences, quietly rebuilding himself in pieces. He stopped near Elias's fence one afternoon, hands shoved into his coat pockets, watching the careful stacking of grass and stone. "Doesn't look like anything I've seen before," he said, voice cautious, as if he feared interrupting a ritual. Elias didn't look up right away. He set another bundle in place, then stepped back. "Most useful things don't," he said. Matthew nodded, considering that. "People say it won't hold." Elias finally turned. "People say a lot of things when they're nervous." Matthew smiled faintly at that. "Mind if I watch?" "Watching's free," Elias said. "Helping costs effort." Matthew hesitated only a second before rolling up his sleeves. He wasn't strong, not like the ranch hands, but he listened well. Elias showed him how to lift without twisting, how to press the bundles tight, how to stagger the seams so no straight line invited collapse. Matthew learned quickly, the way men do when they're grateful for instruction that doesn't come wrapped in judgment. By the end of the afternoon, his hands were raw, his shoulders aching, but there was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before. "Feels solid," he said, patting the wall. "Warmer than it looks." Elias nodded. "That's the idea." Word traveled in Cheyenne Basin the way wind did, unevenly, picking up speed where it found open space. By the time Elias began mixing the clay plaster, curiosity had edged out mockery for some. He dug the clay from the creek bank himself, hauling it in buckets, then mixed it with chopped grass and ash until it formed a thick, sticky mass. When he pressed it onto the walls, it clung stubbornly, filling gaps, sealing the structure inch by inch. Sarah Larkin came by one morning carrying a basket of bread wrapped in cloth. She paused at the fence, watching Elias smooth plaster with his hands. "Looks like you're icing a cake meant for giants," she said. Elias glanced over, surprised. "Didn't expect gifts?" Sarah shrugged, setting the basket down. "Didn't expect to bake extra, but the oven was warm anyway." She studied the walls, eyes narrowing in thought. "You really think this will keep the wind out?" "I don't think," Elias said. "I know how wind behaves when it's denied entry." Sarah huffed a short laugh. "That sounds like something my husband would have said." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She looked away, jaw tightening for a moment, then steadied herself. "He always believed you could reason with hard things if you understood them well enough." Elias wiped his hands on a rag. "He sounds like a sensible man." "He was," Sarah said, "until the fever took him." She met Elias's gaze again. "I hope you're right. About this house. About understanding." "So do I," Elias replied. It wasn't reassurance. It was honesty. Not everyone softened. Hank Pruitt returned with company a few days later, bringing along Jonah Bell, the town's blacksmith. Jonah was a thick-set man in his 50s with arms like tree trunks and a beard so dense it seemed to absorb light. His face bore old burn scars along one cheek, souvenirs from a forge accident years back that had cost him some feeling in his fingers and replaced impatience with caution. Jonah rarely laughed, but when he did, it was deep and sudden. Hank gestured at the walls. "Tell him, Jonah, this is foolishness." Jonah walked the length of the structure slowly, knuckles rapping against stone, fingers pressing into the hood, plaster. He crouched, peered close, then stood again. "It's unconventional," he said. Hank grinned. "That's what I'm saying." Jonah shot him a look. "That's not what you're saying." He turned to Elias. "You'll need a strong roof. Snow loads here don't forgive." "I know," Elias said. "I've salvaged timber enough for a low pitch. Weight spreads better that way." Jonah nodded once. "Smart." He glanced at Hank. "You want foolishness? Look at that sawhouse by the creek. Walls thin as excuses." Hank's grin faltered. He muttered something and stalked off. Jonah lingered a moment longer. "If you need iron fasteners shaped special," he said, "you know where I am." As the walls rose, the air grew sharper. Nights dropped below freezing and stayed there. Elias slept lighter, waking at small sounds, the shift of wind, the snap of cooling wood. Morrow's breath steamed in the dim light of dawn, and Elias checked the horse's joints, rubbing warmth into stiff muscles before work. He had also acquired another companion of sorts, a lean, black and white dog that had begun appearing at the edge of the property, ribs showing, eyes alert. The dog looked young, maybe 2 years old, with a torn ear and a cautious gait that spoke of too many stones thrown by careless hands. Elias didn't call him. He left scraps near the fence and went on working. Trust, like walls, had to be built layer by layer. By the 4th day, the dog lay closer, tail thumping once when Elias glanced his way. By the 7th, he followed Elias at a distance, silent as a shadow. Elias named him Ash, for the gray dust that seemed to follow him wherever he went. By mid-November, the outline of the house was unmistakable. Thick walls enclosed a single main room with a smaller sleeping alcove set back from the wind. The roof frame went up slow and sure, timber set carefully, joints tested twice before pegs were driven home. Elias climbed down from the last beam with stiff legs and a quiet satisfaction that didn't need words. The town noticed. Children stopped throwing pebbles at the walls and started daring each other to touch them. Adults slowed their wagons when they passed. The laughter thinned, replaced by questions asked too casually. How thick were the walls? Didn't moisture worry him? What about fire? Elias answered when asked, ignored when not. He had learned long ago that explanations given too early were wasted. The first real snow came at the end of the week, light but steady, whitening the prairie and softening edges. Elias stood inside the unfinished house as flakes whispered against the roof. The air inside was still. The cold held at bay longer than it had any right to be. He lit a small fire in the temporary hearth and watched the warmth settle into the stone. Outside, Cheyenne Basin hurried. Inside, Elias waited. And Winter, patient as ever, watched back. By the last week of November, Cheyenne Basin no longer whispered about winter. It spoke plainly, with cold mornings that numbed fingers before a man finished buttoning his coat and afternoons where the sun felt decorative rather than useful. The prairie had turned the color of old bone, grass bent low and stripped of softness. Wind arrived early each day and stayed late, testing doors, rattling shutters, learning the weak habits of every building in town. It was the kind of weather that didn't kill outright, but wore people down, one careless decision at a time. Elias Crowder's house had reached a point where it could be judged. The walls stood thick and unapologetic, their rough plaster already curing into a dull earthen skin. The roof sat low and solid, its salvaged beams locked together like men who trusted each other in a fight. Smoke rose clean and steady from the short chimney when Elias lit the hearth, not whipped sideways as it was from most cabins. Even from the road, something about the structure felt different, not impressive, not pretty, but stubborn, as if it had already decided to stay. Inside, the air moved slowly. Elias noticed it the first evening he sat on an upturned crate, boots off, hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee. The fire was modest, barely more than a disciplined flame, yet the chill retreated without argument. Stone held the warmth, the plaster refused the wind. It felt less like shelter and more like an agreement between man and land. Ash noticed it too. The dog lay near the door, curled but relaxed, black and white fur dulled by dust and time. Up close, Ash looked younger than Elias had guessed, perhaps a year and a half, lean in that awkward way dogs are before they fill out. His eyes were amber, sharp and watchful, but they softened inside the house, lids drooping as if the warmth puzzled him. His torn ear twitched now and then, a reminder of a life that had taught him caution early. He slept lightly, but he slept. Morrow, for his part, seemed content in the adjoining lean-to Elias had built against the windward wall. The horse stamped less, breathed easier. Elias brushed him each morning, noting how the stiffness in his hind leg eased quicker than it had in the open corral. Warmth, Elias knew, was medicine that worked quietly. Not everyone observed with such calm. Hank Pruitt's sawhouse by the creek began to complain almost immediately. The thin walls, hastily nailed, shrank and split as the temperature dropped, opening seams that no amount of stuffing could fully close. Hank spent his nights feeding the stove like a gambler feeding a bad habit, waking every few hours to coax flames back from Ash. His temper shortened accordingly. When he passed Elias's place one afternoon and saw smoke drifting lazily upward, he spat into the dirt and kept walking. jaw tight. Others slowed. Matthew Ives returned most days after finishing whatever work he could find, helping Elias with small tasks, stacking firewood along the sun-facing wall, smoothing a second coat of plaster where hairline cracks appeared. The cold had sharpened Matthew's face, given him definition he hadn't worn before. His hands were rough now, knuckles reddened, but there was a steadiness to him that hadn't existed when he'd first arrived. Failure had loosened its grip, replaced by usefulness. "You think people will copy this?" Matthew asked one evening as they worked. Elias considered. "Some will, some won't. Winter doesn't care which." The first real test came not with snow, but with wind. It arrived on a Thursday. Building through the morning until it howled openly by noon, tearing across the basin with nothing to slow it. Loose boards slapped against cabins, smoke reversed down chimneys, doors that had never been a problem before began to creep inward, pushed by invisible hands. The wind found every bad decision and announced it loudly. Inside Elias's house, the sound was different, muted. The walls absorbed the force, turning the roar into a distant, irritated sigh. Ash lifted his head once, ears pricked, then settled again. Elias stood still, listening. Not for noise, but for movement. Drafts were traitors. He felt none. By late afternoon, someone knocked. It was Clara Baines, coat wrapped tight, auburn hair escaped from its pins and whipped across her face. Her cheeks were flushed raw by the cold, freckles standing out like constellations. She didn't step inside right away, as if unsure she was allowed. "I was closing the store early," she said, voice raised over the wind. "The back door won't stay shut. I thought I'd see if—" She trailed off, noticing the warmth spilling out. Elias stepped aside. "Come in." She did, hesitantly, then stopped just inside the door. Her shoulders dropped an inch. "It's warm," she said, surprised despite herself. "That's what it's for." Clara rubbed her hands together, eyes scanning the walls, the low ceiling, the quiet. "I thought people were exaggerating," she admitted. "They usually are." "Usually," Elias agreed. She stayed only a few minutes, long enough to let feeling return to her fingers. Before leaving, she turned back. "If the store pipes freeze," she said, half joking, half not, "I may come back with a sleeping bag." "You'd be welcome," Elias said. He meant it. The wind lasted 2 days. When it finally moved on, it left a trail of small disasters behind it. Broken shutters, cracked windows, frozen hinges. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to sour moods. People gathered in the saloon that night with stories sharpened by drink and discomfort. Jonah Bell listened more than he spoke, heavy arms folded, beard catching the lamplight. "Winter hasn't even started," he said finally. This was a question. Worse ones are coming. Sarah Larkin heard the same wind differently. She lay awake both nights in her room at the boarding house, listening to the walls creak and the window panes shudder in its frame. The children staying there whimpered in their sleep. Sarah pulled blankets tighter, her mind drifting back to another winter, another room, another man coughing until the sound stopped. She rose before dawn on the second day, brewed coffee, and stared at the flame until the light softened. That morning, she walked out to Elias's place. She didn't bring bread this time. She brought herself, shoulders squared, braid tight against the wind. "I don't like asking questions I'm not prepared to hear answers to," she said once inside. "But I need to ask." Elias waited. "If this winter gets as bad as they say," she continued, "will this house hold?" "Yes," Elias said without bravado, "as long as I've built it the way I know how." Sarah studied his face, searching for cracks the way the wind searched walls. Finding none, she nodded. "Then if things get bad, I might bring the children." "Then I'll make more room," Elias said. The next day, snow came properly at last. Not a blizzard, not yet, but enough to change the world's color. White softened the basin, filled ruts, quieted sound. Children ran out despite the cold, shrieking with the kind of joy that ignored consequences. Adults watched the sky with narrowed eyes. Inside Elias's house, the temperature held steady. The stone remembered yesterday's sun. The plaster did its work. Ash slept stretched full length now, belly to the warm floor, trust no longer tentative. Morrow stood calm in his shelter, ears relaxed. Elias sat at the small table he'd built from scrap wood, sharpening a knife that didn't strictly need it. He thought about the way people were looking at his house now, not laughing, not quite admiring, but measuring. Winter had begun to shift something in them. Tradition was strong, but discomfort was persuasive. Outside, Cheyenne Basin prepared in the ways it always had, stacking wood higher, sealing cracks with whatever came to hand. Inside, Elias prepared differently. He checked his walls, his roof, his firewood. He checked his patience. The snow fell into evening, steady and quiet. Lights glowed behind windows across town, each one a small argument against the dark. Elias Crowder added another log to the fire, not because the house needed it, but because habit did. The warmth held, the wind waited, and the questions Winter had begun asking would soon demand answers. December arrived without ceremony, the way truly dangerous things often do. There was no single storm to announce it, no dramatic shift in the sky. Instead, the cold deepened quietly, settling into Cheyenne Basin like an unwelcome guest who intended to stay. The sun rose later each morning and offered little warmth when it did. Shadows stretched long and sharp, and even the wind seemed to conserve its energy, blowing less but cutting deeper when it moved. This was the kind of cold that did not shout. It pressed, patiently, until structures and people alike revealed what they were made of. The town began to change its habits. Men woke before dawn to check stoves and pipes. Women kept kettles on low heat through the night so water wouldn't freeze solid. Children were bundled until they moved like padded figures, laughter muted by wool and caution. Conversations shortened, smiles became rare and practical. Winter had moved from rumor to presence. Elias Crowder noticed the shift not by sight, but by sound. The basin grew quieter. Snow absorbed noise, and cold discouraged unnecessary movement. Even the saloon lost some of its nightly pull. Men chose warmth over bravado. From inside his house, Elias listened to the silence and understood it as a warning rather than a comfort. He spent the first week of December making adjustments. Not repairs, there was nothing broken, but refinements. He sealed the doorframe again, adding a strip of felt salvage from an old saddle blanket. He thickened the plaster near the floor where cold liked to linger. He rearranged the interior so the sleeping alcove sat farther from the door, tucked into the warmest corner of the house. These were small changes, but Elias believed survival was built from accumulations of small wisdom. Ash followed him everywhere, no longer keeping distance. The dog's coat had begun to fill out, black fur growing glossy, white patches bright against the earthen walls. He was still lean, but there was strength in the lines of his legs now, a readiness that spoke of regained confidence. At night, Ash slept near Elias's bedroll, back pressed against the wall, rising occasionally to circle the room before settling again. He had learned that this place did not betray him. Morrow, too, benefited from the changes. Elias added another layer of packed earth around the lean-to, banking it higher against the wind. He hung a canvas flap over the entrance, weighted at the bottom so it would close itself. The horse stood calm, even when temperatures dropped well below freezing, breath steady, eyes half-lidded. Elias brushed frost from Morrow's mane each morning, and felt a quiet satisfaction that bordered on gratitude. The first real failure in town happened on December 9th. It was Hank Pruitt's saw house. The roof sagged under the weight of wet snow that froze overnight, and one of the beams, green wood rushed into service, gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. No one was hurt, but the damage was enough to make the house unsafe. Hank stood outside in the cold, hands shaking not just from the temperature, staring at the wreckage with disbelief that quickly curdled into anger. Pride was a heavy thing to carry when your shelter lay broken at your feet. By evening, word spread that Hank and his wife were staying temporarily with relatives. The story traveled quickly, stripped of sympathy, sharpened by fear. If Hank's house could fail, whose would be next? That question brought visitors. The first was a man Elias didn't recognize, arriving just before dusk on a gray mule. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, a traveling doctor who followed rail lines and ranch routes, offering what care he could where permanent physicians were scarce. Reed was in his early 40s, tall and narrow, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on a long nose. His beard was neatly trimmed, streaked with premature gray, and his coat hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight and not bothered to replace the garment. His eyes, however, were alert and kind, the eyes of a man who had seen suffering and learned not to look away. "I was told there might be a warm place here," Reed said, dismounting stiffly. "I've got frost in my fingers and a patient down the road who doesn't need me shaking." Elias waved him in without hesitation. Inside, Reed paused, visibly surprised, then let out a long breath. "Good Lord," he said softly. "This is remarkably stable." Elias poured him coffee. "Cold makes liars of weak buildings." Reed smiled at that, flexing his fingers near the fire. "You might be onto something, Mr. Crowder." Reed stayed the night, sleeping on a borrowed blanket near the hearth. He spoke little of himself, but enough came through. Years spent in towns that boomed and vanished, illnesses that moved faster in winter, people who waited too long to seek help because travel was dangerous. Before leaving at dawn, he walked the perimeter of Elias's house, tapping walls thoughtfully. "If more folks built like this," he said, "I'd have fewer patients." The second visitor came not by choice. It was young Lucy Mercer, no more than 6 years old, brought by her older brother when the cold crept through their cabin and refused to leave. Lucy was small for her age, all elbows and knees, with dark hair cut unevenly as if someone had trimmed it themselves. Her skin was pale, lips tinged blue despite the scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She didn't cry. She simply clung to her brother's coat and shivered. Elias ushered them in immediately. The warmth worked slowly but surely. Color returned to Lucy's cheeks. Her eyes, a startling green, lifted to take in the space. She smiled once, tentative, like she wasn't sure smiling was allowed yet. Their mother came soon after, breathless and apologetic, a thin woman with tired eyes and hands roughened by washing and scrubbing. She explained that the stove had gone cold in the night and wouldn't draw again. Elias didn't ask questions. He set them up near the hearth, fed Lucy broth, and sent Matthew to fetch Jonah Bell to help fix the stove. They stayed until morning. That night marked a change. It wasn't announced. There was no meeting, no agreement. But something shifted in the way people looked at Elias's house. It was no longer an oddity. It was a solution. Quiet, unassuming, effective. Sarah Larkin noticed it first. She had been watching from the boarding house window as the Mercer children were brought inside Elias's place. The memory of her own loss tightened in her chest. She gathered the children staying with her, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, and checked their blankets again, though she knew it wouldn't make the cold less persistent. That night, she slept poorly, listening to the building's groans, feeling the air grow colder by degrees. In the morning, she made a decision. She walked out to Elias's house after breakfast, children in tow. "I'm not asking yet," she said when Elias opened the door. "I just want you to know I might." Elias nodded. "The door stays open." By mid-December, Elias's house had become something like a quiet landmark. People didn't gather there openly, but they noted it. When pipes froze elsewhere, Elias's did not. When fires died overnight in other homes, his coals still glowed. The difference was undeniable, and denial was a luxury winter didn't permit. Elias himself felt the weight of it. He hadn't built the house to prove anything. He had built it to live. Now it carried expectation, and expectation could be as dangerous as cold if it wasn't handled carefully. He set boundaries without cruelty, one family at a time. No crowding. Preparation mattered. Warmth was not infinite. Outside, the cold continued its slow advance. The river skimmed with ice. Trees cracked at night with sharp reports that echoed across the basin. Stars glittered cruelly bright. Inside, Elias added another log to the fire and watched Ash lift his head, tail thumping once. Morrow shifted in his shelter, comfortable enough to sleep. The cold had walked into Cheyenne Basin, and Elias Crowder's house stood ready to meet it. The week before Christmas carried a particular kind of weight in Cheyenne Basin. The calendar suggested celebration, but the land had other priorities. Cold thickened until it felt physical, something a person had to move through rather than merely endure. Snow no longer melted between falls. It layered itself carefully, packing into corners, climbing walls, reshaping paths people had walked their entire lives. The basin seemed smaller now, compressed by white and silence. Winter had stopped asking questions. It had begun issuing demands. Elias Crowder felt the shift most keenly at night. He slept lighter than he ever had, not from fear, but from awareness. The house was warm, reliably, remarkably so, but warmth carried responsibility now. Each creak of timber, each muted thump of wind against the walls was a reminder that people beyond these walls were listening for failure. Elias rose often to check the hearth, not because it needed tending, but because habit had become vigilance. Ash followed him each time, nails clicking softly on the packed earth floor, amber eyes bright in the firelight. The dog had changed again. His ribs were no longer visible beneath his coat, and his movements carried confidence instead of caution. He was still quiet, still alert, but now there was a looseness in his posture that spoke of trust fully given. When Elias stopped, Ash sat. When Elias rested, Ash rested too. Whatever scars the dog carried beneath his fur, the house had given him a place to set them down. Morrow felt it as well. On mornings when the temperature dropped far below zero, Elias found the horse standing comfortably, breath slow, ears relaxed. Frost gathered on the canvas flap of the lean-to but did not penetrate. Elias ran his hands over Morrow's neck, felt warmth beneath the hide, and allowed himself a small nod. Animals were honest judges. They didn't believe in theories. The first knock came just after dawn on December 18th. Sarah Larkin stood outside with 3 children bundled nearly beyond recognition. The youngest, a girl of about 5 with pale blonde hair peeking from beneath a knit cap, clutched a ragged doll missing one eye. The 2 boys flanked Sarah, trying to look brave, though their noses were red and running. Sarah herself looked drawn but determined, her shoulders squared under her coat, braid pulled tight against the cold. "I'm asking now," she said simply. Elias stepped aside. "Come in." The change was immediate. The children slowed, blinking, as warmth replaced the bite in their fingers. The girl pressed her face briefly against Elias's coat, then pulled back, startled by her own boldness. Sarah exhaled, long and quiet, like someone setting down a burden she'd carried too far. "They can stay in the alcove," Elias said. "It holds heat best." Sarah nodded, eyes shining but steady. "We won't be trouble." "You won't be alone," Elias replied. By nightfall, the house held more life than Elias had ever intended. Children whispered and giggled as warmth returned sensation to their toes. Sarah moved efficiently, helping where she could, hanging damp mittens near the hearth, calming the youngest when memories of cold still trembled in her limbs. The space felt smaller, but not strained. Elias had planned for density. He had not planned for hope, but hope found room anyway. News traveled faster than snow. The next day brought Jonah Bell, escorting a man Elias had seen but never met. Caleb Warren, a ranch hand from the southern edge of the basin. Caleb was 35, broad through the chest, with a face cut from hard lines and disappointment. His beard was thick and untrimmed, his hair long and tied back with leather cord. One of his eyes, left, was clouded pale gray, the result of a kicked horse years earlier that had shattered bone and ended Caleb's chance at driving teams. Since then, he had been quieter, slower to trust, earning his keep with fence work and solitary tasks. Caleb's cabin had failed overnight, not dramatically, no collapse, no fire, but insidiously. The stovepipe iced over while he slept, smoke backed up, the air grew foul and cold together. He woke dizzy, confused, and stumbled outside into the snow before he understood what was happening. Jonah found him an hour later, barely conscious, fingers numb and useless. Caleb leaned heavily on Jonah's arm as they entered Elias's house. His remaining eye scanned the room with guarded disbelief. "Feels like a lie," he muttered hoarsely. "It's just warmth," Elias said. "No tricks." Caleb sank onto a bench, hands shaking. Ash approached cautiously, then rested his head against Caleb's knee. After a moment, Caleb's hand dropped to the dog's neck, fingers curling weakly into fur. He closed his eye and let the warmth do its work. By evening, Elias faced a decision he had been avoiding. The house was holding. That wasn't the problem. The problem was people. More would come. Winter was tightening its grip, and desperation had begun to edge out pride. Elias knew the limits of his walls. He had built them strong, but not infinite. He spoke with Sarah first. "I can keep this many warm," he said quietly, "but if the worst comes, and it will, I'll need to choose carefully." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Then choose the children," she said, "and those who won't last the night otherwise." Elias nodded. "That was my thinking." That night, a storm arrived, not with wind, but with weight. Snow fell heavy and wet, piling quickly, pressing down on roofs, burying fences. By morning, the basin looked smothered, paths vanished, sounds dulled further. People emerged slowly, faces tight with calculation. Some roofs sagged dangerously, others leaked where ice dams formed along eaves. At the Mercer cabin, the stove finally failed. Mrs. Mercer did not hesitate this time. She wrapped Lucy and her brother in every blanket she owned and set out before dawn. Elias saw them coming from the doorway, silhouettes moving through falling snow, and waved them in without a word. Lucy smiled when she saw Ash reaching for him as if greeting an old friend. The dog wagged his tail carefully, as though aware of the fragility of the moment. By midday, Elias's house sheltered 11 souls. It should have felt crowded. It didn't. The air remained warm, steady. Stone released heat slowly, evenly. The plaster held firm. Elias rationed firewood not out of scarcity but discipline. 1 log at a time. Enough, never excess. Caleb Warren, once he regained strength, insisted on helping. His movements were slower now, but deliberate. He repaired the lean-to flap, reinforcing it against the accumulating snow. He cleared drifts from the roof edge with careful strokes, favoring his good eye. When Elias offered him rest, Caleb shook his head. "I've taken enough already," he said. Hank Pruitt watched all of this from a distance. His pride had not yet thawed, but the cold was patient. On the 21st, Hank's relatives informed him they could no longer keep his family. Too many mouths, too little heat. Hank stood in the road for a long time that evening, staring toward Elias's house, breath fogging in the dark. He didn't come that night. He came the next morning, hat in his hands. Elias opened the door before Hank knocked. The sawmill man looked smaller in the cold, mustache uncurled, eyes tired. "I was wrong," Hank said bluntly. "About a lot of things." Elias stepped aside. "Come in." That act, quiet, unceremonious, changed something fundamental. The house was no longer Elias Crowder's experiment. It was a promise, not spoken aloud, not guaranteed, but demonstrated. The promise that winter could be endured without cruelty, that survival did not require stubborn adherence to failure, that warmth, properly understood, could be shared without being diminished. That night, as snow continued to fall and the basin lay silent beneath its weight, Elias sat near the hearth, Ash at his feet, Morrow shifting comfortably in his shelter beyond the wall. Children slept curled together like cats. Adults spoke in murmurs, voices softened by relief. Elias stared into the fire and thought of the coming weeks. Harder storms, deeper cold, choices yet to be made. But for now, the house held, and so did the people inside it. The blizzard announced itself the way a predator does, first with silence. On the morning of December 27th, Cheyenne Basin woke beneath a sky so pale it looked scrubbed clean of color. The air felt hollow. Sound carried oddly, as if the world had been padded in preparation. Elias Crowder stepped outside just after dawn, coat pulled tight, and felt it immediately in his bones. This was not another hard day. This was something larger, the kind of weather that did not test buildings alone, but memory, judgment, and nerve. By noon, the wind arrived. It came low at first, sliding across the basin, lifting loose snow and setting it moving like living skin. Then it strengthened, rising in pitch until it howled openly, a sustained roar that flattened distance and erased edges. Snow followed, thick and relentless, driven sideways until it stung exposed skin like grit. Visibility shrank to yards, then to feet. The basin disappeared into white confusion. Inside Elias's house, the change was felt not as cold, but as pressure. The walls held, but the storm leaned on them hard, testing every joint, every decision Elias had made in the past months. The sound inside was muted yet constant, a deep, steady moan like the sea heard through stone. Children stirred, confused by the noise. Sarah moved among them with practiced calm, her voice low and even, reminding them to stay near the warmth. She had tied her hair back tighter than usual, braid pinned high, as if order itself were a defense. Elias counted heads again, 12 now. Adults and children mixed, fear threaded differently through each of them. He met their eyes one by one, not offering reassurance he couldn't guarantee, but presence. Presence mattered. Ash paced at first, nails scraping lightly against the floor, ears flicking at every new sound. He stopped only when Elias knelt and placed a hand on his neck, steady and firm. The dog leaned into the touch, breathing slowing, choosing trust again. Morrow stamped once in the lean-to when a particularly violent gust struck, then settled as Elias checked the flap and spoke to him in that low voice that had always meant safety. By mid-afternoon, disaster struck elsewhere. They heard it before they saw it, a distant cracking sound, sharp and final, carried through the storm. Somewhere to the east, a roof gave way. Then another sound followed. A scream, brief and cut off by wind. Elias did not hesitate. Caleb Warren was already pulling on his coat, movements efficient despite the storm. "That was the Miller place," he said, squinting toward where the sound had come from. "They've got a boy." Elias grabbed a rope, looped it around his waist, and handed the end to Jonah Bell, who had joined them that morning when his forge chimney iced over. Jonah's face was grim, beard rimed with frost already forming. "We don't lose sight," Jonah said. It was not a suggestion. They stepped into the storm together. Outside, the world had no depth. Snow erased horizon and ground alike. The wind shoved and clawed, trying to knock men off their feet. Elias moved by instinct and memory, counting steps, angling his body just enough to resist being spun sideways. The rope went taut. Jonah and Caleb braced behind him, 3 men moving as one. They found the Miller cabin half buried, roof collapsed inward under the weight of snow and ice. The door was jammed. Elias forced it open with his shoulder, pain flaring bright but irrelevant. Inside, the air was bitter and stale. Mrs. Miller was crying, face raw, hands useless with cold. Her son, Henry, 8 years old, red-haired and freckled, lay pinned beneath a beam, eyes wide and unfocused. Caleb lifted the beam with a grunt, muscles straining. Elias pulled the boy free, wrapping him in his coat. Henry whimpered once, then went limp. Too cold, too quiet. They did not linger. The storm punished hesitation. They dragged Mrs. Miller with them, half carrying, half pulling, following the rope back into the white chaos. Elias felt the wind tear at his breath, felt the weight of the boy against his chest, felt nothing else. Inside the house, warmth rushed them like a tide. Sarah took Henry at once, laying him near the hearth, rubbing his limbs with steady pressure. Clara Baines appeared from nowhere with blankets and hot water, her usual neatness abandoned, hair loose, eyes fierce with focus. She had come earlier that day when the store finally surrendered to the cold, and now she moved like someone who had discovered purpose beneath fear. Dr. Thomas Reed arrived less than an hour later, guided by Jonah once the wind slackened just enough. Reed's fingers were stiff, his face drawn, but his mind was sharp. He worked quickly, efficiently, breathing warmth back into Henry's body inch by inch. When the boy finally gasped and began to cry, the sound cut through the room like a blessing. Mrs. Miller collapsed then, relief breaking her knees. No one judged her for it. Night fell without distinction. The storm did not care about darkness. It made its own. Wind screamed around the house, snow piling high against the walls until Elias worried briefly about the door. He checked it twice, shored it once more, then trusted the weight of his decisions. They took shifts through the night. Jonah sat near the door, massive frame blocking drafts. Caleb stayed awake with Elias, feeding the fire with disciplined care. Sarah and Clara rotated among the children, soothing nightmares, whispering stories that had nothing to do with snow. Ash lay at the center of it all, rising only when someone cried, pressing close until the crying stopped. Near dawn, the wind reached its peak. The house shuddered, not in fear, but in effort. Plaster dust sifted down in one corner where a small crack formed, quickly noticed, quickly sealed with damp clay kept ready for just this purpose. Elias's hands moved automatically. Preparation was a language the storm understood when morning finally came. It brought no light, only a thinning of sound. The wind dropped from a scream to a howl, then to a constant sullen rush. Snow still fell, but straight now, heavy and vertical. The worst had passed. They emerged cautiously hours later. Cheyenne Basin looked broken. Fences vanished, roofs collapsed, drifts swallowed entire wagons. Smoke rose weakly from a handful of chimneys that had survived. People moved slowly through the wreckage, faces stunned, eyes hollow. The storm had taken livestock, homes, and nearly lives. It had not taken Elias's house. Word spread fast, carried by survivors rather than gossip now. The house on the north edge had held. It had sheltered children. It had saved a boy pulled from beneath a roof. It had not failed. Elias stood in the doorway, Ash at his side, Morrow visible behind him in the lean-to, alive and steady. He felt no triumph, only a deep, exhausted gratitude. The storm had taken names this time, marking those who would not be forgotten. It had also revealed something else, that what Elias had built was no longer just shelter. It was proof, and winter was not finished yet. The days after the blizzard did not feel like victory. They felt like accounting. Cheyenne Basin emerged slowly from the storm's shadow, as if unsure the violence had truly passed. Snow lay in heavy drifts, reshaping familiar paths into obstacles that demanded new routes. Roofs sagged where they had not collapsed outright. Fences leaned or vanished. The river ran dark beneath a skin of ice, its voice muted. People moved carefully, conserving strength, tallying losses in quiet conversations held with breath, steaming in the cold. Elias Crowder woke before dawn each morning, not from alarm, but from habit sharpened by responsibility. The house remained warm, the walls holding their steady agreement with the land, but the air inside had changed. It carried resolve now, and something else, expectation. Elias felt it as weight more than pressure, a knowledge that his decisions mattered beyond his own survival. Henry Miller recovered quickly. By the third day after the storm, he was sitting up near the hearth, cheeks flushed, appetite returning with a boy's enthusiasm. His freckles stood out brighter against skin newly warmed, and his red hair caught the firelight like a challenge to winter itself. Dr. Thomas Reed checked him once more before preparing to leave town, pressing his stethoscope against Henry's chest with careful patience. "He'll be fine," Reed said, straightening. He looked more tired now than he had during the storm, lines etched deeper around his eyes. "You didn't just save a life, Elias. You saved a future that will remember this place kindly." Elias nodded, unsure what to do with praise that felt too large to accept whole. The house did its job. Reed smiled thinly. Houses don't choose to open their doors. Before he left, Reed took time to speak with several families, offering advice on frostbite, on ventilation, on what signs of illness could not be ignored. His presence lingered even after he rode out, a reminder that knowledge moved as quietly as warmth and mattered just as much. The town began the work of repair with whatever energy remained. Jonah Bell organized crews to shore up structures that might still be saved. His scarred hands worked steadily despite the cold, guiding others with the calm authority of a man who had survived fire and learned its lessons. Caleb Warren joined him daily, his one good eye assessing angles and loads with an intuition born of long experience and a past mistake that had taught him caution the hard way. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. Sarah Larkin coordinated care for those left vulnerable by the storm, children without proper shelter, the elderly whose strength had been thinned by cold. She moved through the basin with efficient compassion, her voice firm but kind, her presence grounding. The children followed her instinctively, trusting the steadiness she offered. At night, when she returned to Elias's house, she sat near the fire and allowed herself moments of quiet that looked like prayer without words. Clara Baines reopened the general store with a narrow inventory and fierce determination. She rationed fairly, recorded debts without judgment, and refused to sell anything that would leave a family colder for the sake of profit. Her hair was pinned again, though loose strands escaped constantly, and her freckles seemed darker against skin weathered by days of hard work. People began to look to her not just for supplies, but for decisions. Ash adapted to the new rhythm as if he had been born for it. He learned the sounds of the house at rest and at work, the patterns of feet and voices. He positioned himself where needed without being asked, near the door when strangers approached, near the children when fear flickered, near Elias when thought ran heavy. His torn ear still twitched at sudden noises, but his tail wagged more freely now, a signal that safety had become expectation rather than surprise. Morrow bore the changes with patient dignity. Elias checked him daily, ensuring hooves stayed clear of ice, joints warm. The horse had lost a little weight during the storm, but held his strength, eyes clear, breath steady. Elias spoke to him often, not because the horse needed words, but because Elias did. The habit kept him anchored. On the 5th day after the blizzard, a stranger arrived from the south. He came on a sturdy roan mare and introduced himself as Nathaniel Brooks, a county surveyor sent to assess damage and report on conditions. Brooks was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed beard and hair already thinning at the temples. His coat was well made but worn, boots scuffed from travel. He carried himself with a professional distance that softened when he spoke, revealing a man accustomed to balancing authority with pragmatism. A childhood bout of polio had left him with a slight limp, one leg shorter than the other, and the experience had shaped his patience as much as his gait. Brooks walked the basin methodically, measuring, noting, asking questions that cut through rumor. When he reached Elias's house, he stopped longer than elsewhere. He circled it once, then again, tapping walls, examining the roofline, the way snow had banked harmlessly against the structure. "This held," Brooks said, more statement than question. "Yes," Elias replied. Brooks removed his gloves, rubbing his hands together. "I've seen a lot of failures in the past week. This isn't one of them." He hesitated, then added, "Would you be willing to explain your methods?" "Officially." Elias considered the request. The house behind him held children sleeping off exhaustion, adults mending themselves with quiet talk. Sharing knowledge felt different now. It carried consequence. "I'll explain," he said finally. "I won't promise miracles." Brooks smiled. "I've learned not to trust those." The conversation drew others. Jonah listened, nodding. Clara asked pointed questions about materials. Sarah stood back, arms folded, watching Elias navigate a role he had never sought but could no longer avoid. When Brooks left, he did so with pages of notes and a respect that was careful rather than effusive. That evening, the house felt quieter despite its occupants. People spoke of rebuilding, not just repairing, but rethinking, of thicker walls, lower roofs, of paying attention to how wind moved, how heat stayed. The ideas were tentative, fragile as seedlings, but they were there. Elias listened more than he spoke, offering guidance only when asked. He understood that belief, once imposed, could break under pressure. Belief discovered tended to endure. After supper, when children were settled and adults drifted into low conversation, Sarah joined Elias near the hearth. The firelight softened the lines of her face, highlighted the strength beneath fatigue. "You didn't plan this," she said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "But you're carrying it." "Yes," she nodded. "Then don't carry it alone." The words settled between them, not as comfort, but as strategy. Elias looked at her and saw not grief but resilience shaped by loss. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been held too tight for too long. Outside, the sky cleared for the first time since the storm. Stars returned, sharp and numerous, indifferent but beautiful. The cold remained, but it had changed character. It no longer felt triumphant. It felt finite. Elias stepped outside briefly before bed, Ash at his heel. He looked over the basin, broken, enduring, familiar in its altered shape. The house behind him radiated warmth into the night, a quiet defiance that did not boast. Winter was not finished. He knew that. But neither were they. The storm had taken names, yes. It had also left something behind, a way forward that did not depend on luck alone. Elias returned inside, closing the door carefully, sealing warmth where it belonged. January arrived without cruelty, and that alone felt like mercy. After the blizzard, Cheyenne Basin settled into a quieter winter, still cold, still demanding, but no longer openly hostile. The wind moved with less anger now, drifting rather than striking, and the snow that fell did so gently, as if the land itself had grown tired of proving its power. Days lengthened by minutes that people noticed and welcomed. Nights remained sharp, but they no longer carried the same threat. The basin, battered and reshaped, had entered a phase of endurance instead of crisis. Elias Crowder felt the change most clearly in the mornings. He woke before dawn as always, but now the air inside the house felt settled rather than tense. The walls released warmth evenly through the night, and the fire rarely needed more than a careful stir. Ash slept stretched fully on his side, paws twitching occasionally in dreams that no longer woke him. Morrow stood calm in his shelter, stamping only when hungry, not when afraid. These were small things, but Elias had learned to trust small things. The house was no longer crowded. Some families had returned to repaired homes or shared quarters elsewhere, carrying with them not just gratitude but ideas. They left behind extra firewood, jars of preserved food, tools mended and sharpened. No one called it payment. It was acknowledgement, offered without ceremony. Sarah Larkin remained, not as a guest exactly, and not as someone who had nowhere else to go. She stayed because the house had become a place of work as much as shelter, and because Elias had not asked her to leave. She slept in the alcove with the children on the coldest nights, and in the main room when space allowed, rising early to help plan meals, organize supplies, and check on neighbors who still struggled. Her presence was steady, not intrusive. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that survival was a shared responsibility. Caleb Warren stayed as well, though he slept in the lean-to when weather permitted. He had repaired more than he had broken in the past weeks, and the work seemed to ease something old and bitter inside him. The pale eye still stared unseeing, but the other watched carefully, thoughtfully. He spoke more now, offering insight when asked, deferring when not. The storm that had nearly killed him had also stripped away the last of his resentment. What remained was usefulness, and he treated it like a gift. Jonah Bell visited often but slept elsewhere, preferring his forge even when it ran cold at night. He had begun sketching ideas in charcoal on scraps of wood, thicker walls, altered roof pitches, foundations that dug deeper into the earth. His scarred hands moved with new purpose. "I've been shaping iron my whole life," he said once to Elias. "Never thought much about shaping shelter." Clara Baines became something like a ledger for the town's future. She tracked who owed what, who had skills too. Trade, who had space to spare. The store was no longer just a place to buy. It was a hub of planning. Clara's sharp eyes missed nothing, and her fairness earned trust quickly. When disputes arose, people sought her opinion without embarrassment. Nathaniel Brooks returned once more before the end of January, this time with confirmation. The county would not mandate new building practices. That kind of authority moved too slowly for frontier life, but Brooks's report had been circulated. It recommended, strongly and in writing, the methods Elias had used: thicker walls, mixed materials, attention to wind and heat rather than aesthetics. Local adaptation, Brooks called it, common sense formalized. He delivered the news with professional restraint, but there was something like satisfaction in his voice. "You've started something," he told Elias privately. Elias looked out over the basin, where smoke now rose from repaired chimneys, and new foundations marked fresh intent. "They started it," he said. "I just listened." By mid-February, rebuilding had begun in earnest, not everywhere, and not all at once, but enough to notice. One house near the creek went up low and wide, its walls packed thick with earth and grass. Another used stone at the base, timber only where needed. Children helped tamp clay. Women mixed plaster. Men measured twice and cut once, learning patience they hadn't practiced before. Laughter returned cautiously, edged with humility. The basin looked different, not transformed, but wiser. Elias spent less time teaching and more time observing. He corrected when asked, stepped back when not. Leadership, he had learned, was not about standing at the front. It was about knowing when to let others walk ahead. One afternoon, as the sun hung low but bright, Sarah joined him outside where he was repairing a section of fence exposed by the storm. The air was cold but gentle, the kind that promised spring without guaranteeing it. "You could leave," she said casually, handing him a tool. "Now that everyone knows what to do." Elias took the tool, considered the fence line. "I could," he said. "But you won't." "No," he agreed. Sarah smiled, a small thing, but real. "Good." That evening, after supper, Elias did something he had not planned but found himself ready for. He cleared a space near the hearth and unpacked a small box he had kept sealed since before winter. Inside were papers, claim documents, notes, sketches of the house as it had grown. He spread them out, smoothing corners. "This place," he said, voice steady, "belongs to more than one set of hands now." No one spoke at first. Then Sarah nodded. Caleb inclined his head. Even Ash lifted his ears, tail thumping once against the floor. They didn't make speeches. They didn't promise what couldn't be promised. But an understanding settled among them, firm as stone beneath packed earth. Winter lingered into March. Stubborn, but diminished. Snow fell and melted again. Water ran where ice had ruled. The basin breathed differently. When the first meadowlarks returned, their calls sounded tentative, as if testing whether the land remembered how to listen. Children ran to the door to hear them, faces bright. Elias stood with them, hands on hips, feeling something like completion without finality. The house stood unchanged. Its walls bore the marks of use, scratches, soot, places where plaster had been repaired, but they held. They always would, as long as people remembered why they were built the way they were. The house had not conquered winter, it had outlasted it. On a clear morning near the end of the season, Elias saddled Morrow for the first long ride since the storm. The horse moved easily beneath him. Strength returned. Ash followed, bounding through melting snow, stopping often to look back and be sure Elias still came. From a rise above the basin, Elias looked down on Cheyenne Basin as it truly was, scarred, standing, altered. Smoke curled from chimneys built with care. New roofs caught the light. Paths wound differently now, shaped by learning rather than habit. Elias tipped his hat not to the town, but to the land itself. The ground had learned their names, and it had chosen at last to let them stay. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, shaped by patience, compassion, and the courage to care when the world turns cold. In Cheyenne Basin, no angel descended in the storm. No voice spoke from the clouds. Yet warmth appeared where it should not have. Lives were spared when logic said they would be lost. And a simple house became a refuge, not because it was perfect, but because love lived inside it. Perhaps that is how God still works today. Not always through grand signs, but through ordinary people who listen. Through hands that build instead of point. Through hearts that open when fear tells them to close. In our own lives, we may not face blizzards of snow, but we all face storms, a loneliness, loss, moments when the world feels colder than it should. And maybe, just maybe, we are called to be the shelter for someone else, or to recognize the shelter God has quietly placed in our path. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need warmth today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you or where you're watching from. And if you believe in kindness, second chances, and quiet miracles, please subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them. May God bless you and your loved ones. May He protect every child, every animal, and every weary soul watching this. And may you never forget, even in the coldest seasons, you are never alone.